Well, again, welcome to all. For approximately the last 6 months, we enjoyed the light half of the year. The half of the year where there is the most daylight, and many of us saw the light. We came to see God's great plan for us, courtesy of His annual holy days that teach us about that great plan. Now, some of us actually heard about God's plan for the very first time this past year. Others learned more about His great plan, and we all learn a little more each year as we rehearse God's great plan of salvation year after year as depicted in His annual holy days. But few actually know of God's true plan of salvation for man and woman. Satan, that great deceiver, he wants to be like God. In fact, he wants to be our God. As in Isaiah 14, verse 14, Satan says, "I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High." Of course, Revelation 12, verse 9 tells us that old serpent called the devil and Satan deceives the whole world. But Satan isn't original in its deception. We find that most often he counterfeits the ways of God to deceive us. A counterfeit is similar to the real thing, but there is always a difference, often a major difference between the original and the counterfeit. Counterfeit money may appear to be very much like the real thing, but in actuality, it is of little or no value. God has declared that all His annual holy days occur in the light half of the year. In John 9, verse 5, Jesus says, "I am the light of the world." Our Bibles often speak of light and darkness. Satan's counterfeit holy days, actually called holidays, they occur in the dark half of the year. But the called of God are called out of Satan's darkness and into the light. 1 Peter 2, verse 9 tells us, speaking to us, he says, "But you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, that you should show forth the praises of Him who has called you out of darkness into His marvelous light." God's true holy days teach us of His true plan. They give us great hope for the future and for the loved ones that Satan would have us believe are even now being tormented for eternity. Those who follow Satan's counterfeit holy days have torment, unlike those who follow God's holy days. They fear for their loved ones. But we know that God is love. 1 John 4, verse 18 tells us, "There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because fear has torment. He that fears is not made perfect in love." Those following the true God and His true plan for us do not have the fear and torment that those following Satan's counterfeit holy days do. Each of God's annual holy days teach us great truth about God and His plan for us. For example, the sacrifice of Jesus Christ just for us, the Holy Spirit being poured out, the return of Jesus Christ, and the 1,000-year reign of Jesus Christ and His saints, the resurrection of all the dead back to life, and a kingdom where there will be no more tears, no more pain, and no more death. Wow, I can't wait for that. So God's annual holidays teach us much and give us much hope about our future. They really do. What do Satan's counterfeits teach us? Well, what about Christmas? Well, Christmas teaches us that Jesus was born, right? But if we're to follow Christ in spirit and in truth, we actually know that December 25th is not the birthday of Christ. So where's the truth in this? And what valuable lessons are taught by this holiday? I started to say Satan again. I do this every time. So what valuable lessons are taught by this holiday? Well, for example, that Santa is the one our children should pray to instead of our Holy Father? That seems to be a message. That we should expect material things such as toys or candy or other goods, especially for our children. Is that something of value spiritually? Or is it that we're to decorate our dwellings with evergreen trees as the heathen did as they worshiped their false gods? Well, personally, I find little to no spiritual value in any of the customs of Christmas. It's mostly about worshiping false gods in the manner of the customs of the heathen, while claiming, of course, that they're actually worshiping Jesus Christ. Easter, for example, it's essentially Satan's counterfeit of the Passover. It has our children chasing after bunnies and Easter eggs, again, vestiges of false God worship. Jesus was resurrected, but it was not on a Sunday. And he asked us to remember his death, not his resurrection, great as that was. He also never asked us to observe his birth, but rather his death. But Satan's counterfeits do not worship God in spirit. They worship other false gods in morality. And they certainly don't worship God in truth. Because pagan practices aside, as I just said, Christ was not born on December 25th, nor anywhere close to that date. And of course, he also was not resurrected on a Sunday morning at sunrise either. Our Bibles prove otherwise. Actually, Satan is masquerading as a false sun god, a counterfeit god. Of course, the claims are he would be born on December 25th. Tammuz, the counterfeit son of God, was said to be resurrected on a Sunday. So it's not that these dates are actually wrong. It's just that they were for a different god, a counterfeit god, one of Satan's creation. I said earlier that our true God is a God of light. But all counterfeiters try to dress up their counterfeit to make it look more believable, more appealing to those who are being deceived. They want people to be deceived. 2 Corinthians 11 verse 14 tells us that Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light. And I believe that Satan has those following his holidays, especially Christmas, provide the light that is missing from that time of year. Think about that. He has people place artificial lights outside their homes, on Christmas trees, all over the place in an attempt to transform his dark, counterfeit holy days into a time of light. So I've been driving around after dark lately. I've been noticing a lot of Halloween displays illuminated to be highly visible. Can't miss them. As we enter into the dark season, the time of Satan's counterfeit holy days or holidays, the very first one we encounter is, of course, Halloween. Current estimates are that around $8 billion, that's $billion, will be spent on Halloween this year. Halloween is second only to Christmas in holiday spending. I was curious as to how many American Christians celebrate Halloween. Looked up an article from ChristianToday.com. The article was titled, 23% of Christian Americans don't celebrate Halloween. With some simple math, I suppose that 77% of Christian Americans do celebrate Halloween in one form or another. But from the article, quote, more than 2/3 of evangelicals welcome the candy, costumes, or community interaction surrounding the holiday, but the majority are unwilling to label the pagan elements of Halloween good, close quote. It appears that the majority of those calling themselves Christians observe Halloween. But should true followers of Jesus Christ celebrate Halloween, even if it's renamed to another name? Even if it might be toned down a bit to make it more palatable. Let's go ahead and take a look at Halloween today. Look at its origins and how it's observed today. Halloween's origins date back to the ancient Celtic festival of Samhain. Now, some may have heard this called Samhain, but Samhain is actually closer to the original name. The actual Celts celebrated a day they considered to be holy to their gods. This was a day to celebrate the dead. They observed this day on October 31st. Actually, their new year began on November 1st. On October 31st, the day before, well, that was their last day of their year. Now, the Celts believed that on the last day of the year, the world of the living and the world of the dead would intersect. Spirits of the dead would return to the earth and roam the countryside, playing pranks and making mischief for the living. According to History.com, this celebration was to, quote, usher in the dark half of the year, close quote. which is exactly what we've been talking about, a time of darkness, not of light. Anyway, those in their homes would set out things to eat to help the good dead along their way and also to appease those evil spirits. They were afraid of them, what they might do. And those that needed to leave their homes were concerned about running into some of these evil spirits roaming the earth at that time. They were worried. Some believed they would be kidnapped by the dead that were temporarily invading the world of the living. So how would they avoid these evil spirits if they had to go out? Well, they actually believed that the dead that walked about that night would not harm them or kidnap them if they appeared to be one of the dead themselves. So they dressed up as ghosts, goblins, ghouls, and whatever they thought these evil spirits might look like to become like one of them. They have to blend in with the dead and avoid detection. Now, if you think about it, I think we all know that the dead actually know not anything. We can read that in Ecclesiastes 9, verse 5. We know that the dead sleep in their graves, as Jesus says, until the resurrection. They don't roam the earth. But the false religions of the past, and I suppose a few even today, teach that humans have an immortal soul, capable of roaming the earth or anywhere else for that matter. The religious leaders of the Celts were called the Druids. They had large sacred bonfires, or as they were originally called, bone fires. The people would get together to burn animals as sacrifices to the Celtic gods. And this, they hoped, might also bring them some additional protection from these mischievous roaming spirits. Well, I can understand why they call them bonfires. The bones of the animals were all that were left after being burned in those fires. If we go back far enough in time, I think we'll find that the ancestors of the Celts actually burned humans, particularly children, in these bonfires. As we've discussed before, the false religions of the Bible were mostly based on false sun gods. Notably, most of these false sun gods, like Molech, required the sacrifice of young children or infants by fire. We've all read about that. So are we beginning to get the feeling that Samhain was not from God, but rather satanic in origin? Well, according to the Satanic Bible, Halloween, or also known as Samhain, is one of the three most important holy days for Satanists. When it comes to witchcraft, Samhain, or Halloween, tops the list of Wiccan holy days, coming in at number 1. Now, besides the bonfires, what are some other traditions of Samhain? Well, there's the legend of Stingy Jack. This is kind of hard to believe, but this is what they tell us. The legend says that Stingy Jack tricked the devil into buying him a drink. He talked the devil into turning himself into a coin he could use to buy this drink. But then Jack prevented the devil from returning back to himself. Well, eventually he allowed the devil to become himself again. But there was more trickery between Jack and the devil. Jack then tricked the devil into climbing a tree, and then put a cross on the tree, preventing Satan from coming down out of the tree. Now, at least that's what the legend says. You might want to look this up in more detail for yourselves. But the bottom line here is that after being tricked by Jack several times, according to legend, the devil didn't want Jack with him. He didn't want Jack in hell. So when Jack died, the devil denied him entrance into hell. You can't come in here. But then neither would God allow him to enter heaven. Jack was sent away from both heaven and hell into the night to roam the earth forever. Now, Jack had only a burning coal to light his way during the night. He placed that piece of burning coal into a carved-out turnip to carry it. People started referring to Jack as Jack of the Lantern. This was shortened to Jack-o'-lantern. Now, people who were afraid of Jack, as well as the other evil spirits, began to carve scary faces into turnips or potatoes. This was, of course, to frighten away Jack and all those other evil spirits roaming the earth, especially on Halloween. Now, eventually, pumpkins began to be used for this purpose. Now, they were larger and easier to carve, perhaps, also plentiful in many locations at that time of year. So we see pumpkins today. People still carve scary faces into pumpkins even today. I suppose to keep Jack and all the other evil spirits away during that night of Halloween. There was another activity the Celts practiced on the 31st of October. Fortune tellers would tell the people of the future. And of course, fortune telling is still popular on Halloween. I had a relative once that played the part of a fortune teller in the local church's observance of Halloween. And if you wanted to just talk to the dead, what better time than October 31st, when the world of the dead is said to be closest to those of us that are living. So seances were a popular tradition of Samhain. I think we can certainly say this was a great time for the occult. Now, these were just some of the rituals and traditions of Samhain as the ancient Celts observed it. Around 43 A.D., the Romans had conquered most of the Celtic lands. The Romans also had a day that celebrated the dead. It was called Feralia. Of course, naturally, the two celebrations merged. In addition to the Celtic gods, the Romans worshipped the goddess Pomona. Pomona was the goddess of fruit and trees. The symbol of Pomona is the apple. And of course, all the Roman goddesses were fertility goddesses as well. It was the Romans that brought the tradition of bobbing for apples in a tub filled with water. Or in some cases, the apples were suspended from trees. Of course, the idea was you couldn't touch the apples with your hands, put those behind your back. You just grab them in your mouth. The objective was to be the first to actually bite into an apple. That was the winner. And the first person to bite into the apple was said to be the next to marry and have children, courtesy, of course, of the fertility goddess Pomona. I don't think we see or hear a lot about apple bobbing today. But if you watch some older movies and TV shows, particularly cartoons, I'm sure you'll run into it. These are just some of the traditions of the Celts as they followed their false gods and added Roman god and goddesses to the mix. But the Romans weren't the end of the outside influences, though. The Catholic celebration of All Martyrs' Day was established on May 13th, 609 A.D. Later, All Saints were added to All Martyrs' Day. The observance was then moved from May 13 to November 1st. Around the 9th century, Christianity had spread into all the Celtic lands. The two celebrations in late October that each observed was merged into one. Around 1000 AD, the Church declared November 1st All Souls' Day in honor of the day. This day is also known as All Hallows' Day. The evening before was known as All Hallows' Eve and eventually became known as Halloween. It was celebrated with big bonfires, people dressed up as devils and angels. Does that sound familiar? Well, that's a brief history of Samhain as it evolved into the Halloween we know today. So, what about Halloween today? As I may have said, it's the nation's second largest commercial holiday, right behind Christmas. As we said earlier, around $8 billion is expected to be spent on Halloween this year. Let's take a look at the customs of Halloween today. Things such as jack-o'-lanterns, seances, fortune-telling, trick-or-treating, and just general mischievous behavior we see. Let's begin with the jack-o'-lantern. As we saw earlier, Jack of the Lantern is a mythical character who roams the earth and a mischievous spirit at that. The jack-o'-lanterns we see today were originally used in an attempt to scare Jack and the other evil spirits away. But today, do we really believe that Jack and other evil spirits of the dead descend upon us every October 31st? Do we need protection from them? And if we did, would we really carve a pumpkin to protect us? Well, first, if we read our Bibles, we know that the dead are dead. The dead know not anything. They sleep, as Jesus describes it. They're not harassing people on October 31st, or as I said, any other time for that matter. So they're not there. Second, if we truly are expecting a carved pumpkin to protect us in some way, isn't that like relying on an idol and not on our Heavenly Father as the Bible tells us to do? Could we even be going so far as to teach our children idolatry? 1 John 5 verse 21 tells us, little children, keep yourselves from idols. Amen. Well, what about seances? Any problem there? Let's turn to Leviticus, if you would. Leviticus chapter 19. Leviticus chapter 19, we'll look at verse 31. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 31. So what about seances, or communicating with the dead? Now, this is a popular activity on Halloween, and I believe it is very possible that during a seance we might just communicate with the spirit, but not the spirit of a dead human, rather the deceiving spirit of a demon. But again, Leviticus 19, verse 31. Regard not them that have familiar spirits, neither seek after wizards to be defiled by them. I am the Lord your God. I'd like to read that again in the Contemporary English Version. It says, don't make yourselves disgusting to me by going to people who claim they can talk to the dead. You might notice that our Bibles don't tell us we can talk to the dead, which we can't. It speaks of those who claim that they can talk to the dead. Let's turn over to Leviticus chapter 20. That's one chapter over, I believe. Leviticus chapter 20 in verse 27. Leviticus chapter 20 and verse 27. So, what about the people who claim to receive messages from the dead? How does God feel about them? Does God excuse this practice as harmless fun, as many insist it is today, as many practice today on Halloween? Let's see. Again, Leviticus chapter 20, verse 27. A man also, or woman, that is a familiar spirit, or that is a wizard, shall surely be put to death. They shall stone them with stones, their blood shall be upon them. Again, let me read this to you in the Contemporary English Version. I think it's a lot more clear. It says, if you claim to receive messages from the dead, you will be put to death by stoning, just as you deserve. Whew, ow. Pretty rough. God clearly does not approve of us attempting to contact the dead. Like we said, the dead don't know anything. If one hears from the dead, it's most likely a demonic spirit they're actually hearing from. So it's certainly no surprise to me that God would forbid this. What about fortune telling? Turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 18 for that, if you would. That's Deuteronomy chapter 18 and verse 10. That's Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 10. I think I mentioned earlier that I had a relative in my church at the time that became a fortune teller on Halloween. That's right. They even had a crystal ball. Well, this is somebody in the church. But again, Deuteronomy 18, verse 10. There shall not be found among you anyone that makes his son or his daughter to pass through the fire, or that uses divination, or an observer of times, or an enchanter or a witch. Again, Contemporary English Version reads, don't sacrifice your son or daughter, and don't try to use any kind of magic or witchcraft to tell fortunes, or to cast spells, or to talk with the spirits of the dead. What else shall not be found among us, according to God? Verse 11. Well, a charmer, or a consulter with familiar spirits, or a wizard or necromancer. What is necromancy? Well, according to the Free Dictionary Online, it is the practice of supposedly, again the word supposedly, it is the practice of supposedly communicating with the spirits of the dead in order to predict the future. Now, I'm very glad that my relative gave up this practice on Halloween. Verse 12. For all that do these things are an abomination unto the Lord. And because of these abominations, the Lord your God does drive them out from before you. You shall be perfect with the Lord your God. So our Bibles clearly tell us not to engage in fortune telling or to attempt to talk to the dead, but rather we are to perfect ourselves in the ways of God, not in the traditions of those who followed other false gods. So next, what about trick-or-treating? What about parents that tell their young children to disguise themselves as ghosts or goblins or a cartoon character or something else, and then go to a stranger's house and tell them trick or treat, implying, of course, that if they aren't given a treat, perhaps that person might just suffer a trick. In other words, some mischief might just befall them. I'm not trying to say that parents actually intend to trick the homeowner, or that they even put their children up to doing so. However, they do teach their children to utter those words, trick or treat. And the meaning of those words is clear. Either you give me a treat or I'll play a trick on you. And that's, of course, extortion. Now, many of you might be saying, hey, I don't teach my children to actually destroy property or threaten anyone, so where's the harm? I mean, come on, Alan, you're being too serious here. Well, am I? Matthew 12, verse 36. If you would turn to Matthew chapter 12, verse 36. Matthew 12, verse 36. Why do we teach our children to say trick or treat? Why do we do that? If we don't mean what we say, then these are really just idle words, are they not? Again, Matthew 12, verse 36. Now, these are the words of Christ. But I say to you, that every idle word that men shall speak, they shall give account thereof in the day of judgment. For by your words you shall be justified, and by your words you shall be condemned. So whether we're serious or not, should we be teaching our children to say those words, trick or treat? And what if we teach our children to observe the other pagan traditions of Halloween? Is God pleased by this? In Jeremiah chapter 10, God tells us not to follow the practices of the heathen. Those practices are said to be vain. They're empty. They're devoid of value at the very best. Turn with me next, if you would, to Matthew chapter 18. That's Matthew chapter 18. We'll go to verse 2. Matthew 18, verse 2. So we're told not to do these things. But what if we actually teach our children to follow these heathen traditions? What then? Well, you might say, really, what's the harm? It's just a little game we play. Unless how many people respond, they don't see it as a problem. Let's see what the Bible says. Let's take a look at Matthew 18, verse 2, and see what Jesus has to say about this kind of thing. Again, Matthew 18, verse 2. And Jesus called a little child unto him, and set him in the midst of them, and said, Verily I say to you, except you be converted and become as little children, you shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. Whosoever, therefore, shall humble himself as this little child, the same is greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoso shall receive one such little child in my name receives me. Verse 6. But, there's a but here. But, whoso shall offend one of these little ones which believe in me, it were better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck, and he were drowned in the depth of the sea. That's pretty serious. So, Jesus tells us whoever offends a child, well, things won't go well for him. He'd be better off if he was drowned in the depths of the sea. So I would say from this passage that we never want to offend a child. But what does the word offend in verse 6 mean? That's important to know, I'd say. The word offend here is the Greek word 4625 in Strong's. It's the word scandalizo, and it means to scandalize, to entrap. That is, trip up or entice to sin. By teaching our children to follow the ways of the heathen instead of the ways of the true God, are we enticing them to sin? Remember in Jeremiah 10, verse 2, Thus says the Lord, learn not the way of the heathen. Yet, that is exactly what we're teaching our children when we teach them to follow the ways of those who worship those false gods. Turn over next, if you would, to Deuteronomy 12, verse 29. That's Deuteronomy chapter 12 and verse 29. What else does God have to say regarding those traditions, the ones that worship false gods? Again, Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 29. When the Lord your God shall cut off the nations from before you, where you go to possess them, and you succeed them and dwell in their land, take heed to yourself that you not be snared by following them, after that they be destroyed from before you, and that you inquire not after their gods, saying, how did these nations serve their gods? Even so will I do likewise. Verse 31. You shall not do so unto the Lord your God, for every abomination to the Lord which he hates have they done to their gods. For even their sons and their daughters have they burnt in the fire to their gods. And pay close attention to verse 32. What things soever I command you, observe to do it. You shall not add thereto, nor diminish from it. Or as the easy-to-read version translates verse 32, you must be careful to do everything I command you. Don't add anything to what I tell you, and don't take anything away. We should all worship God in the way he commands us to do, by observing his true holy days, for example, and not diminishing or taking them away, like many have. Nor should we add anything to what God has told us, such as following the ways of others who worship other gods and goddesses, false gods and goddesses. One of the first couple of commandments prohibit that. But the ancient Celts worshiped sun gods, not the true God. In the distant past, they sacrificed their children in those bonfires. So to many of you, this is all too familiar. Do we really want to follow after the ways of the heathen? Or do we want to follow the ways of the true God? Do we want to teach our children the ways of the heathen or the ways of our wonderful God? Halloween, by the way, is also known as a night of mischief. I remember lots of mischief, especially as a child. Turn to Proverbs 24, verse 1, if you would. That's Proverbs 24, verse 1. We often see pranks on Halloween. Many times they result in property damage, or at least the need to clean up the mess that's left behind. Should we be even a part of a night where mischief abounds? Proverbs 24, beginning in verse 1. Be not envious against evil men, neither desire to be with them. For their heart studies destruction, and their lips talk of mischief. Go down to verse 8. Verse 8. He that devises to do evil shall be called a mischievous person. The thought of foolishness is sin, and the scorner is an abomination to men. Do we even want to be associated with those who cause trouble on this night? If you would turn over to 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 5. That's 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 5. Many times in our Bibles, Jesus tells his disciples that we are children of the light. We are not of darkness. Paul mentions this one more time here in 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 5. Here he's talking to us, Jesus' disciples, and he says, you, that's us, are all the children of light and the children of the day. We are not of the night, nor of darkness. So we're told repeatedly that we're children of the light, not of darkness throughout the Bible. So I mentioned at the beginning today, the 7 annual holy days that God commanded us to observe begin in the spring and end in the early fall. These 7 holy days all occur when there's plenty of light in the day. All 7 occur during a 6-month period of light. Beginning late October, we see the daylight portion of the day significantly decrease. We also see the beginning of man's or Satan's counterfeit holy days, known as holidays. They occur during the dark half of the year in relative darkness. But as children of God, we are the light, not of darkness. You might recall that we saw earlier that Samhain was a celebration to, quote, usher in the dark half of the year. And I can't think of a more dark holy day, or should I say holiday, than Halloween. Are we the children of light, observing God's declared holy days during the light time of the year? Or are we the children of darkness? Does our holy day season begin as the season of darkness begins, starting with the darkest holiday of them all? When I grew up, I celebrated Halloween. I went trick-or-treating myself. I didn't know any better. Most people don't. But what really surprises me is how so many Christian pastors, now these are men that supposedly know their Bibles. It surprises me that not only do they not condemn this holiday as satanic and an abomination to God, many actually promote it as just good, clean fun. How can they know their Bibles and still promote a time of death, of fear, a time when we forsake the true God and follow the traditions that go back to all those false gods of the past? Halloween's a night for seances and fortune-telling, a night to offend our little ones by telling them that the traditions of the heathen, the traditions of those who follow false gods, are just fine and just good, clean fun. But as we've seen today, God doesn't consider these practices good, clean fun. He considers them abominations. He suggests we be better off hanging a millstone around our neck and being drowned in the sea. That's pretty serious. What should we do if our pastor tells us it's just fine to celebrate Halloween? Or if our pastor celebrates Halloween in the church? Simply renaming it trunk or treat or some other name to try to disguise it as something godly does not hide it from God. He's not fooled, and neither should we be. What should we do if our pastors actually promote Halloween? Let's turn to Ephesians 5 verse 6 view. That's Ephesians 5 verse 6. I'd like to let the Apostle Paul answer this question. I think he can do that for us. I'm sure we trust the Apostle Paul. He's always got some good advice for us. Again, that's Ephesians 5 verse 6. Here's what Paul tells us. I think this is good advice for all of us. He says, again, Ephesians 5 verse 6, "Let no man deceive you with vain words, for because of these things comes the wrath of God upon the children of disobedience. Be not, therefore, partakers with them. For you sometimes were darkness." Yes, at one time, many of us were in darkness. As I said, at one time, I didn't know any better. I participated in Halloween as a child. I even had my own children participate. But then you might say, I saw the light. The light God calls us into when he calls us out of darkness. Again, Ephesians 5 verse 8. "You were sometimes darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. For the fruit of the Spirit is in all goodness and righteousness and truth, proving what is acceptable unto the Lord. Have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them." Paul tells us not to fellowship with those who deceive us and teach the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather to reprove them or to rebuke them. I know some of you have actually done that. I know that takes some courage. But in Acts 5 verse 29, you might recall that Peter and the other apostles said, we ought to obey God rather than men. Turn next, as we get ready to close here, to Romans 12 verse 2. Romans chapter 12 verse 2. Romans chapter 12 verse 2. Here's some questions for you to answer. Would Jesus Christ really go trick-or-treating? Would he participate in the mischief of Halloween night? Would he carve jack-o'-lanterns? Would he participate in any part of this satanically inspired holiday? What do you think? I would encourage everyone to consider the words of Paul as he speaks to us in Romans 12 verse 2. He says, "Be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God." I think that's great advice. So finally, as we close today, the last scripture, let's turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. That's 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 20. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 20. When it comes to celebrating Halloween, at the very beginning of the dark season, do we honor devils? Or do we stand steadfast for the Lord? That's the question. Again, let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 20 to close. "But I say that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, They sacrifice to devils and not to God. And I would not that you should have fellowship with devils. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of devils. You cannot be partakers of the Lord's table and the table of devils. You know, as we said before, in the end, it doesn't matter what I think. It doesn't matter what your local pastor might think. What really matters is the cup from which we drink. Which shall it be?